So yeah, bad news is that there are lots of reasons why players leave games. The good news is that actually we've got the technology and the processes and the methodologies to figure out why and start to do something about it. And my approach to this, as Al was saying, comes from outside the games industry. For many years, big organizations have been looking at their data, trying to figure out how to build intelligent relationships with their customers, and to then proactively be responsive to those relationships and build value into them. We founded Delta DNA 4 years ago, as Al said, to actually bring that approach into the games industry. We're incredibly lucky in the games industry because within the virtual world of the game, we know a lot about the players. We can collect really rich event data. We can figure out whether players are novices or experts, if they're gaining momentum, if they're losing momentum. And then we can start to think about these player characteristics and proactively make the game responsive to that, helping and encouraging when we need to, and making offers for payment when it's appropriate. And actually then the game becomes a personalized experience. And that's at the heart of my talk today, that we're talking about concepts like game personalization, we're talking about player relationship management. And it's actually a really exciting area because we can take the game from being a broadly similar experience for all different types of players and actually make it a very bespoke, very customized experience and make the game responsive to the different types of players that are in there. And what I'll do in the next sort of 20, 25 minutes is to talk you through some of the approaches and some of the techniques for doing that. So, Delta DNA, as I say, was founded. We've got a platform that takes data from the game. It has advanced analytic tools that allow you to figure out why players are leaving, why players are buying, why they're not buying. But very importantly, using in-game messaging, using game rebalancing, using push notification, start to deliver on those insights. We're really trying to take the guesswork out of game design, and we're trying to make sure that we're understanding what experiences players are having in the game and being responsive to that. So the context to this is that, as everybody that works in the industry knows, CPI rates have been increasing quite dramatically. It's a really confused market out there, chaotic, in fact. If you just walk around the show, you can see that there's any number of acquisition, advertising suppliers out there. And it's really hard to chase high-value, engaged players and get them into your game at a reasonable value, at a reasonable cost. So, we work with clients and they may use 20, 30 different acquisition providers for paid acquisition. Now, that's a real overhead on businesses. And actually trying to chase high quality at low cost is pretty fruitless. Our view on this is that actually we're looking to solve this problem in the wrong place. And if we concentrated on how we engage players in the game and how we develop them, how we then increase lifetime values, you can then optimize the experience and go back into the acquisition market with a much more profitable activity. Increasing LTVs means that you have much more reach into the acquisition market. And this is a slide from the guys at Superdata, which is up to the end of last year. But I think you will know that the trend continues where LTVs and CPIs are kind of matching each other, or even CPIs outstripping LTVs around the Christmas period last year. And that continues to be a real problem, a real challenge for the industry to make as many games as we can viable. So what I'll do is I'll talk you through some of the economics behind making games profitable, making the experiences better, and also building engagement, because it's a virtuous circle. If we build better experiences and more bespoke experiences for players, we will increase engagement and we will increase revenue by those very actions. Over the few hundred games that we've been working on, we've been noticing that actually the state of engagement in general is pretty poor. If you've got the majority of games delivering under 40% of players returning after session 1, that's not great. And that's saying something about, sure, people will download the game and it'll not be for them, but there's too many players that are having a poor first 60 seconds and then leaving the game never to return. And we really need to do something about that and be proactive about that. That also then generates a subsequent problem, is that you've got a smaller pool of engaged players that will convert to paying. Sure, you'll get lucky and there'll be a percentage of whales that will start to convert from session 1 and spend and keep spending. That's great. But the effort is in, once players are engaged, encouraging them to part with some money to continue their gameplay and feel good about that. There's a value exchange at the heart of this. What do we want out of our playing base? Do we want their commitment and time? Do we want some moderate spend? Do we want them to connect with other people to build the ecosystem? I think players in the new world of online games are getting used to that value exchange, and expect us to give them offers, to reward them, to be very responsive in terms of how we build the experience, so that that exchange is appropriate. It doesn't feel overbearing. It doesn't feel manipulative. And that's the sort of thing that I'll talk you through in terms of how our platform is used by our clients to really build that interaction with the player base. So the economics are pretty harsh, but we can move the dial significantly. That's not to say that it's a trivial thing to solve. Actually developing these games, as most of you will know, is really, really difficult. You're trying to get balancing right, and you're trying to adjust a number of things, and it's a multi-dimensional problem. As well as our platform, we run some consultancy on free-to-play game design and analytics, and over the games that we've worked on, we start to see trends in terms of different mechanics and how well they're executed in games. And these are ones that, at the heart of this talk, why do players leave your games? These are some of the issues that we need to resolve as an industry. It's not only why players leave your game, but giving them reasons to stay as well, obviously, is the other side of that same coin. So, for example, through our benchmark framework, we will play games, our design team will play games, and they'll assess those games in over 50 criteria, score them from 0 to 10 in terms of the execution of that particular mechanic. And these are the 10 mechanics that we see across the industry, across the games that we've worked on, being most poorly executed. Appointment setting there is at the top. Giving players a really strong reason to return to the game that is appropriate to them. It actually responds to their playing style. The tutorial is absolutely vital, giving people opt-outs. One of the biggest things that we see is actually the recognition that a player comes into your game and they may be a very novice gamer. They may be trying games for the first time. They may also be an expert. So actually giving them a route through the game that gets them to the place that they want to be as quickly as possible is absolutely vital. So give the novices the extra support. Get the experts into bigger challenges quicker. There are really strong metrics that we use a lot. One of them is playing speed, which tells us a bit about the player's competency. If the playing speed, which we measure in events per second, is low, then the player is cautious and maybe a bit frustrated and unsure, and we should then be able to do something about that. Recognize that it's a novice player that needs extra tuition, extra support. The other side of that same coin is that expert players will play through the first few levels very quickly. They're trying to get to better challenges. recognizing that and giving those players level passes, getting them deeper into the game quicker. Those sorts of things will fundamentally improve your engagement rates dramatically. And that's what is at the heart of game personalization. It's segmenting the players in behavioral groups that allow us to give those players different treatments as they go through the game. So obviously there's extremely good implementations of this stuff as well. On a mechanic by mechanic approach, these examples, which most of you will recognize, are very strong. The reality is that you have to kind of do this stuff all together. That's where the difficulty lies. You're trying to juggle a number of competing dynamics here. You can maximize engagement, but then you might cannibalize some revenues. So it's a constant balancing act and it's constant juggling. And this is where, actually, to take the guesswork out of the game design and the game development process, we need as an industry to start relying on the data to tell us where the right balance is, what the players are experiencing, and then start to make those changes through A/B testing, through game rebalancing, through dynamic responsive games. So at the heart of how we think about this is a concept called the threshold of engagement. And there are certain things that players will experience that will stop them engaging with the game. Some of them are out of your control, but a lot of them are under your control. And once we've moved players through that threshold of engagement, then there are other things that we can do to deepen and broaden that engagement with the game and actually start to monetize players and get them to reach their potential. The real thing to bear in mind, though, is that not all players move through that threshold of engagement at the same time. And this is where game personalization and player relationship management has got a real role to play. Segmenting players into discrete groups that share characteristics means that you can start to think about your game from those different player characteristics and break down the game into different experiences that those different player types are having. How do we do that? The data is rich. We can collect lots of event data, tells us about mission outcomes, tells us win-loss ratios, tells us playing speed, players' momentum, their intensity of gameplay. We know about competency from this data. We know about purchase decisions and how they use their resources. And actually building these dimensions into our thinking to create player segments is really powerful and actually is a great way for development teams and publishers to start to talk about the players and the game in a common currency. And what I mean by that is probably best illustrated by this example. This is a game that we worked on where engagement rates were low, monetization rates were low, getting towards the end of beta, things weren't looking great. There's big concern about the game. And we wanted to try and figure out what was the problem, because the game was fine, the gameplay looked good, it was it was a nice looking game, but something wasn't happening. Something wasn't building that engagement. So taking that segmentation approach and using the platform and the data and the visualization tools, we can start to look at breaking the player base down. We did it by aggression, we did it by rewards, as you can see in the dimensions on the chart. And that started to characterize different playing types. On the bottom right there, we've got the strategic elite. Those are guys that, in this deathmatch MMOs environment, were very, very expert players, high kill to death ratios, high engagement initially. But actually they felt that the game was under rewarding them for their gameplay, for their success. So they were disengaging quite quickly after the first few missions. On the top right there, we've got what we called the kamikaze killers. These were guys that were shooting indiscriminately, having great fun in the game, getting lots of rewards, lots of grind currency, but ultimately not spending because they had lots of grind currency. So we had the core audience leaving. We had really engaged players not monetizing. And so it was the worst of all possible worlds. So by tweaking the reward system and by starting to deliver real-time messaging into the game that was specific to these different player segments. We started to see the kamikaze killer segments starting to monetize it, less grind currency anyway, and we were putting in front of them great offers for weapons and ammo upgrades. So this is the sort of approach then that actually unlocks engagement and unlocks revenues in games. And that thinking takes us really far in terms of building engagement levels and building revenues and making far more games across the board viable. We think about our messaging strategies in this sort of context where initially, if you think of the player lifecycle, we've got retain and engage is our strategy, then socialize if that's appropriate to the platform, and then monetize. Engage before you monetize is always the rule. And obviously at the back end of the life cycle, you're trying to engage. There's quite a few different options in terms of how you then set up individual triggers and messages to build that engagement level and build that monetization. And this is where we're starting to get into proactive player relationship management. If we do this by different segments, then we get to a really responsive game for the different characteristics of players that you've got in there. And as I was saying earlier, then you start to see your analytics really starting to deliver clear insight and actionable insight. So we often see our clients' culture changing, where the guys in the business, the analytic guys and the developers and the designers, the producers, they all get together and they think about the player segments, they monitor the performance, they look at the insight, delivering how the player's experience is going, and most importantly, action things, whether it's A/B testing, testing the balancing of the game, test and learn, and through that constant cycle, optimize the development process. One of the neat things about the technology is that it stands alone from the development team, so you can control the messages without, after the implementation of the SDK, without having to bother the development team from their core task of building out the game content and that side of things. So this is where, as the games industry is moving to online free-to-play, and this is the core part of the industry now, these sorts of new skill sets and this sort of collaboration is now becoming the standard culture of effective publishers and developers. So I'll probably leave it there and leave time for a couple of questions. Thank you for listening. And
thank you, Mark. I have a question right off the bat. You touched on the problem of the increasing cost of player acquisition. CPIs are just going up. But organic player acquisition is free to us. We just need to motivate our players to go out and invite people in, challenge people, challenge friends, bring them in. Has your company done anything towards improving organic player recruitment?
Yeah, it's a really interesting area that's also driven from the data. One of the concepts around segmentation, one of the metrics that you can use is social connectedness. So if you think about the game being a social network, then players can either be at the heart of that network and have lots of dependencies and lots of links to other players, so therefore be very influential of that, that immediate group, or they could be on the periphery of these network groups. And so part of the messaging strategy is to recognize that and then to reward, encourage certain behaviors based on that information. So if you're a very influential person, you may not be generating much money in your own right, but you certainly would want to treat those players as a potential whale or as valuable as a whale, because if they disengage, then lots of their friends will go with them. And that's a very important dynamic of how you start to build these messaging strategies.
Good point, because if you can motivate somebody to recruit a new player, that's worth like $2 or $3 to me. I hate to see 50% of those ones that I paid for just walk out the door after the first session. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Regarding segmentation, how do you take a continuous variable like your events per second or whatever that you mentioned as the player's level and break that into categories? I mean, do you usually see actual groupings, or do you just kind of take this and say, well, we're going to divide it into 3 categories and go from there?
So in the platform, there's visualization tools that allow you to plot the distributions of these things, and sometimes it's fairly easy to see, splits in the data. If it's fairly uniform, the data, then what we can run is some percentile bandings and create sort of 5 banding, let's say, from low to high, and at least you've got. It's important to have the relativity. It's less important to have the delta, the actual value. So if somebody playing speed is super high, you don't really mind if that's 100 or 120. You just want to know that it's high, and then the segments are created from that. The segmentation is a thinking tool first and foremost, and then secondarily it's a planning tool for your messaging strategy. So you don't need to really worry about the banding so much in terms of where specifically they land. It's just getting the relativity right.
We have time for one more question. If there's not one from the audience, I have another one. It's generally accepted that we lose about 50% of new players after the first session. When you've applied your technology, and you've done this to a lot of different games, what kind of range of improvement do you see in that retention?
So, not quite that measure, but one of the measures that we focus on a lot is an engagement measure, which is a pretty severe measure. It's a pretty tough measure. It's how many of the players have been in the game each day for the last 10 days. And one of our case study examples is that we improved that by 350%. So, actually thinking about each stage of the player life cycle and keeping as many players engaged in the game and moving through the game actually has dramatic effect in terms of the tail end. And obviously, a part of that is moving the numbers, the 50% or the 40% not returning, and giving them really good reasons to return. And that goes back to the 10 points that we had on the previous slide, which is all of these mechanics need to be well balanced in general, but also we can let players off the hook if they made a dumb mistake in the first 60 seconds. If we see their resources sinking below 50 gems and they can't play on, let's gift them, let's keep them going, because it's much better gifting them, keeping them going, than them leaving and never seeing them again.
Thank you very much, Mark Robinson.
Thank you.